On this week's show, we're going to be covering the south half of the River Bottom Farm, how it's matured over the years and how I've gone about tackling it and changes, etc., the deer success on that farm. Couldn't be happier with how productive it's been, and it's a property that I plan on holding on to for a long time and handing down to my kids and continuing the legacy on that farm. Hey guys, welcome back to another week of Midwest Whitetail. On this week's show, we're going to be covering the south half of the River Bottom Farm. I mentioned this a few weeks ago. We covered the north half. You guys can find that episode a couple weeks ago. We went live if you're interested in hearing about the north half of the farm. I had bought that piece in 2017, so we kind of went through all the maturation of that property and how it's matured over the years and how I've gone about tackling it and changes, etc., the deer success on that farm. This week we're going to cover the south half, which is a piece I bought in 2020. Also, I closed on that new property that I mentioned a month or so ago. It's 76 acres down the road from the River Bottom Farm, and so we'll be diving into a little bit more of that property on an upcoming episode. So as you guys know, the River Bottom Farm's a special place to me. It's been super productive for the last 5 or so years, and we just are making tons of memories out there. And in 2020, the neighbor to the south put his property up for auction, and there was a bunch of parcels in that auction, but one of them was this 340 acres of WRP that butted up against the ground we already owned. You know, my initial reaction is, boy, if I get that, it's gonna just change the whole dynamics of this place. Because before we had 224 acres, a lot of it was that big peninsula, so it was like 100 acres up by the road that we were trying to manage and hunt, and you can only hold so many deer on there. And certainly on the north side, those first few years of ownership, we went through the flood, but there were a lot of deer that were coming and going, right? We weren't really holding deer. In 2020, I had the option of bidding on this farm at auction, and was fortunate enough to get it purchased. And it's added 340 acres. And so diving right in, my initial goals were I got to get the CUA in place. So we went over this a little bit last time. Wetland, there's a lot of rules on a wetland easement. And to do food plots, you got to get a compatibility use agreement in place. The previous owner actually had a CUA and he had food plots in place. And so he had not maximized his 5% of acres. So I was able to start planning where he had put his food plots, but then also do a little bit of design on where and what I wanted to do to try to help the farm as a whole. So now we're working with 563 acres or whatever it is. This particular piece of property had really good tillable on it, and so when they enrolled it, they planted a really nice mixture of natives and is a lot more open with a lot higher quality native grasses on it. So has a great pheasant population. And it had a lot less of those little willow thickets and kind of thick areas. Even the timber along the river and on the little peninsula on that side is pretty open. Whereas if you walk through the north half of the farm peninsula or the wetland grassy areas, there's thick pockets, which aids in the bedding. And so when I first got this property, I was a little bit like, it's gonna be interesting to see how the deer utilize it and learn about it and hunt it, because it wasn't readily apparent what was gonna be the best. You know, some of my immediate goals when I bought it were gonna be, how do I thicken up certain areas and improve bedding and improve habitat? But first and foremost, as I mentioned, get the COA in place and get food in place. And so with 340 acres, 5% of that, you can do about 17 acres. And so this big central food plot where I shot merino a few years back, we refer to it as a merino plot. It's kind of in the center of the entire property. And so I put 8 acres of food there, which I was hoping, we have a ton of trouble growing food down there. Obviously soil conditions, but also deer pressure and other wildlife pressure on the food. And I had the previous owner who had all the equipment at that time come in and help me out and get it mowed off and sprayed and drilled, and we were able to get food in there right away. I don't have a plot that size on any of the other farms I have, and I really put it there for late season food, but more importantly to hold deer through the winter, be able to find their sheds. And it wasn't necessarily for bow hunting over. It was like, it'll work for late season, but also my goal is just have centralized food to hold deer there through the winter and make sure the wildlife are, taken care of through harsh winters. When we were first hunting the north, our original farm, the north piece of the River Bottom farm, and we were hunting the head of the slough and some of these spots back in the peninsula, you would see deer, as I talked about in the previous episode, going out to the north, but then you also see deer coming out of the peninsula and heading to the south. And I didn't own that property, and I just knew they were going somewhere. This really comes to fruition in late season now, where you can watch, like last year, sitting on the merino plot and seeing where deer come from. I mean, they come out of the big peninsula and they come out of the central timber, and those are 2 primary bedding areas on the whole river bottom. And I put a few stands on the edge of the big peninsula for bow hunting over the years of seeing that pattern come to fruition, even during season, to try to cut off deer. But it's a difficult spot to hunt, and I'm still learning it for sure. It's been great. The year we put corn, we were able to get a little corner of it with a blind and really harvest a bunch of does on it. That was proved to be a successful way to bow hunt it, and an area I'll look to continue to modify and be able to be successful shooting does right in the center of the property, where hopefully it's mostly resident does and we're really making a difference in the herd as a whole. And then last year, I've just been playing around with how I move the blind for late season. Originally, it's set way back in the corner, easy access in and out from where we park. Last year, I moved it further down as I see where deer tend to come from late season, so that we can hopefully set it up better for bow hunting. And then this year, one of my plans is to put a green food source like in front of the plot. So normally I just put it all in beans. I've tried all corn once, but I think the beans work better and last longer. So we'll plant it all to beans, and then later in the summer we can till in a ½ acre in front of the redneck blind and put a brassica plot, and that can pull those deer into bow range hopefully. And that's something I'm looking forward to, hopefully catching up to one of those big tins that we saw last late season. So the next spot we're going to jump to is the central timber, and this in my mind is the best spot on the farm. It wasn't something that I noticed or I picked up on the map, because honestly, when you're driving around the property, it's really open when you're ground level. You can just see right across it, and I wasn't sure that the deer were going to use it really. I was actually going into my head thinking when I first bought the farm, like how I was going to thicken it up some to improve the bedding. That first year we got it in 2020, I was really focused on DAC, and I was hunting the north side of the farm a ton. And I just hunted the south side occasionally, a handful of times that year. I did get cameras obviously spread all around that south piece, and I had gotten a couple pictures of DAC in the central timber. So I made a few sits, and I made a few sits on the north side. I found a little white oak, and Chase and I got in that white oak one morning and had some really cool encounters. Early on in property ownership, every sit, I'm always trying to gather as much information on patterns as I can. And some of the things I noticed on that very first sit in that little white oak was how many deer come out of the destination ag fields and how they move back into that central timber. If you look at the aerial, there's all these little sloughs that have curved, and they're basically old Oxbow sloughs when the river had moved across that land a long time ago. But they drive movement patterns. There's sloughs and little ridges, and the deer tend to walk back into that area. And they really do utilize that area as a major bedding spot. And that's been witnessed now over the years, over and over and over. And it's one of the best spots on the property because of how many does bed in there. I mean, in the rut, it's just been phenomenal because all the bucks come and they're searching for does, and you can see across it, and so you can see a deer off in the distance and call to them, and it's really just been a cool spot. So one thing I noticed that day, obviously I'd been on the farm and doing cameras, and on the south side of the central timber, there's an old farm road. And one of the first projects I did was fix the washed out culverts so that I could get back there with the tractors and do work on the Oxbow area. Well, having that all patched up and having a lot of water in the sloughs on either side of it, there was an obvious pattern of deer movement there. They were using that as a little highway to get in and out of the bedding spot. And I could see that from the north side, those movement patterns. And so you start, again, picking out trees, and that's how the Poseidon set came to be, actually watching that movement. And on the south side of the central timber, knowing where the farm lane was, knowing where the slough was, seeing that movement in November, thought, man, we need to find a tree over there. And obviously later that summer we went in and picked a tree and set it up, and that's where I had success shooting Poseidon and obviously going after Kelsey, and there's a lot of sits out of that tree, and it's such a cool spot. Another big observation of spending time there in the central timber was the effect that wet water has on movement there. And so we've had some really wet years where all the sloughs are full, and I started hunting it based on the deer and the way they moved around those full sloughs. And then we had the really dry year, the last 2 years really, but hunting Kelsey. And 2022 was the first time I spent lots of time on that side of the farm because I was hunting Kelsey. And so he had moved down there, and it was really interesting. It was one of the first times I really saw that pattern of a deer that I know really well from the north side of the farm, and then just completely shifting. And we would previously ask ourselves, I wonder where these deer go. Well, just literally right there. He spent so much time on that side of the farm that October and November, and that's where we chased him all season. And probably the most growth I had in learning about that property was during that year. I've got trees picked out to set permanent sets based on a lot of observations in 2022. 2023, we had a similar experience where Fitz normally is on the north side of the farm, and we're shooting lots of mature bucks each year, and so the dynamics are changing. The oaks obviously played a role last year, but Fitz did a lot like what Kelsey did the year before. He just moved to the south end. And so after we caught up with DK October 30th, we had a stretch where we just went after Fitz and bounced around, and we had success relatively quickly on him, unlike with Kelsey, where 5 encounters and no success till late season. I utilized that information from 2022 to strategize hunting Fitz. And we talked a lot about this last little point while we were hunting Fitz. And so those lanes and those sloughs that move into the central timber, there's just a big movement pattern in the morning back that direction, and that's hard to get in on. In the afternoon, coming out of that central timber, they use that old farm lane. And I have put a little plot there, and we have all the red oaks there. And so originally, when I bought this property, I knew it had a really good pheasant population. Originally, that plot started out as like an upland bird plot with sunflower and sorghum and milo and all that good stuff. And then I've transitioned it a little bit. I mean, I've moved my pheasant plots around, and I've got larger chunks of sorghum for the birds. And that last year was just a little green plot. I put the monster buck rut greens there. Ended up getting it in a little bit late. We had the drought conditions. It germinated, but I wasn't getting a lot of bulbs on it, so then we topped it with some rye and oats and had a good little food source there that was supplementing all that mass crop of acorns. I've got the Poseidon set for the morning, or the little oak on the north side for the morning, and then that's a great afternoon spot. And if I have any buck in the future really utilizing that area, confident in those 3 stands on catching up with them. So next we're going to talk about the Oxbow, the Little Peninsula, and we'll include in that the river's edge. And we're just moving slowly south through the property. The Oxbow is literally just that. It's the old riverbed, and it's filled in certainly over the last 70, 80 years, but the main part of the river was channelized around 1940, and that was to aid in the highway going across the river and building that bridge there. And so you got a long, straight stretch to river now. When they channelize the river, a lot of that dirt is on my side, and that affects the movement through that timber along the river a little bit. But the Oxbow has the old riverbed, and it's growed up in a huge cottonwood thicket on the south side of that. And the previous owner, as part of his CUA, had food plots on the high spots between the old river bends. And it's nice because those areas are well drained. I mean, a lot of parts of the river bottom, they're just flat, they don't drain well, and so you can get hosed if you get a heavy rain, like shortly after you plant. So we have about 6 acres total right there, and it's 4 separate little plots. It's a difficult area to hunt with a bow. There's no trees large enough to hold the stand. And so I've played around a little bit over the years with blinds and had some good hunts. But the real idea there with 6 acres is another centralized food source to feed these deer and keep the deer there, similar to the merino plot. I'm still working on figuring out what's going to grow best right there. Because they're so little, I've had trouble with some of the grain. I've planted sorghum there and it did pretty good. The year that rye shot the big 8, you know, the beans were a success. Last year we had the drought conditions, and I think between browse pressure and the drought conditions, I mean, the beans didn't do well at all, so we ended up doing another monster buck green food source on all of those 6 acres. And so this year, we'll go back to the drawing board, need to get some soil tests sent in and help with getting a good grain food source there. I'd like to have beans in the majority of it, and then maybe some rut greens or something just in front of the spots we want to bow hunt. Moving to the Little Peninsula, as I mentioned, it's a lot more open than the Big Peninsula on the north side of the farm, but it works similarly. It's less than half the size. I think an interesting point about the Little Peninsula is I didn't really hunt there till 2022 or so. You know, I had mowed lanes. I thought about how I could move deer or drive deer movement in and out. On the south side, it was very obvious. There was a couple little lanes around that pond that I cleared out and put cameras on. And so I had observation through cutting back cameras on deer movement, and then obviously whenever we were going after Kelsey, that was an area that I dove into and made quite a few sits. But through some sits and observation, it's clear the deer work their way in and out of that scent check-in and then cut across the neck. And so we've got a permanent set I set a few years ago in a big white oak. Had some great hunts there for Kelsey. I mean, good encounters with moss, Tiki, the short G2 buck. I've not killed there yet, but there's a stretch in there that's really thick and deer bed in there. The rest of it's kind of open, and there's noticeable movement patterns in and out of that. And so I think I'm gonna modify where I'm hanging. I like that tree where it is because you've got the pond behind you. Of course, when the pond had water in it, it helped us have an area to blow our wind over. It's nice because I don't have to go in very far. So as far as getting in there in the morning, I can walk down the mowed lane, pop up in the set, and get out easy. I'm not deeper into the peninsula. But there is a tree that I picked up on this last shed season that's a little bit farther in there that I think would give me a better chance of getting deer in bow range during that late October, November period. Moving over to the river's edge, you know, when you look at the aerial photograph, you would think, man, that's going to be a killer spot. It's a narrow strip of timber along the river. It's not quite as great as I would hope it to be. And I think it's sort of interesting how the river works. There's a lot of deer that don't really cross the river, so it acts like a barrier. There are certainly deer that do, and on these drought years when the river's been really low, I mean, we've filmed them just running back and forth across, which certainly changes the dynamics of everything, particularly when it's full and flowing. Because that's like the very far south edge of the property, a lot of deer just move towards the river and then bed. And then you get a little bit of cruising up and down, but not as much as I would expect, or like what we might see in the pinch, where it's a very clear movement right along the river's edge. They're kind of moving in all sorts of directions there. And it's a lot more open than I like, so one of my goals is working with the NRCS to do a TSI plan and try to get some of those bigger river bottom trees out of there and try to generate a little more ground level cover. But it is interesting to me that when they channelized that river, they piled up a lot of the dirt in that timber stretch. And so there's a decent amount of topography there. There's one slough that runs along there, and basically almost like a little levee where they piled up all the dirt. It's probably like a 6-foot change. And so if you just walk through there at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, there's deer bedded all up in there. It's just all up and down that whole area. And there's some areas that are a little bit thick where some big trees have fallen down. There's some scrub brush, there's canary grass. So those areas are the areas they tend to bed down in. But there's also some little pockets of red oaks, and it's an area I'm still really learning about. I think the deer prefer to bed in that cottonwood thicket that's all little trees that runs along that timber strip. So when I get in there, you know, and do calling, we'll have deer come out of that cottonwood thicket. I haven't totally put my finger on the best way to hunt that, but generally speaking, the way I hunt the river, you know, depending on the wind, I can come at it from the east side or the west side, but the obvious way of hunting it is to hunt on the river edge and blow your wind back across the river, and that's worked pretty well. It's just a little bit too wide to really always have deer come in bow range, but we get down where it's a little bit narrow. We try to use that slough in there to our advantage because they tend to walk the edge of it, and then get in a position where we can blow our wind back over the river. We've had some really cool encounters in the handful of times we've hunted it. I mean, we had daggers chasing in the river. Had a really cool encounter down there the first time I hunted it back in 2020 with Chase with a buck we call Blanco. And we'll keep figuring that spot out over the years. I think it certainly has a lot of potential. My observations over time are really a lot of my thoughts around that river edge tie more into our south green plot. There's a pretty obvious inside corner with a lot of bedding around it. The first couple times I ever walked that farm before the auction even occurred, it was spring and I was jumping like 40 and 50 deer out of this area, and there's an old Oxbow pond in there that holds water almost year round, and there's a bunch of willow thicket right behind that, and it's kind of low, and there's just a ton of deer that bed in there. My obvious thought went to, I can tuck in a little rut greens plot in the afternoon, and it's the first spot they'll come and hit before the sun really starts going down. They head out to the big fields, and you got that whole cottonwood thicket, and you got deer bedding along the river, and so we can sneak in and out of there. That's one of the main reasons I chose that spot, was there's a little ditch that leads up to it. You've seen us walk up and down that ditch to get in and out of there. There's deer bedded not far away, and we can get right up to the base of that hackberry up in the tree without spooking the bedded deer. So that spot really lent itself to a food plot because of access, which is something, we always talk about, and it's a difficult thing to figure out on the river bottom farm. It's so flat and open in a lot of spots. Another interesting point about that spot is the funnel that exists there with the timber. There's a big grown-up field on the other side of the timber, and that inside corner where I put the food plot, there's an old farm road that connects those two areas, and there is a clear and obvious utilization of that timber strip between the two fields. It's a classic funnel. It's wide, and it's difficult to put a stand there and hunt based on access and wind, so I've got the food there with the stand, and we watch deer run it and try to call to them. And that area can certainly be optimized some. Again, I think some of those areas in the timber could be thickened up a little bit, but I think where the food is, surrounded by bedding on 3 areas, it's certainly a sweet spot, and it's a spot I picked out right away on the aerial and hung that stand just a few months after closing on the property. And obviously Rye had success there shooting Ronnie, and we encountered Kelsey there, and I've had encounters with the Big 8 and Black Eye 10 and Moss and all these bucks there. Speaking of Moss, I mentioned on the last episode that he's going to be one of the bucks I'm really looking forward to seeing what he turns into this year and probably hunting. And he was one that 2 years ago was all over the south part of the farm. Now granted, he was a 3-year-old, certainly from 3 to 4, 4 to 5, they shift things around a little bit, but he was really, really on the south part, and then last year seemed to be mostly on the north part. And so it's kind of interesting to see those patterns move. Obviously, as I mentioned, we took out a lot of mature bucks, and I think that plays a role in where they end up settling down. But I'm really looking forward to seeing where he's going to be hanging out this year and how we're going to have to strategize to catch up with him. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this week's show, this breakdown of the south end of the farm. I mean, obviously, I've had it since 2020, so just a handful of years. Still a lot to learn, and certainly modifications will occur over the years. Couldn't be happier with how productive it's been, and it's a property that I plan on holding on to for a long time and handing down to my kids and continuing the legacy on that farm. Before we let you go, our partners at UC Hunting Properties have a property in south central Missouri they'd like to showcase. It's a 70-acre property. It looks really awesome, mostly timber. So you guys can check out the highlight video for that. I really hope you guys enjoyed the show this week. As always, we appreciate you watching, and we'll see you back next week.
Hey y'all, my name's Mark James. I'm the owner of United Country Results Realty and Auction. Getting ready to show you a video here of a property that's just completely awesome. It's 70 acres. This property is a stone's throw from the Lake of the Ozarks, so you have all the entertainment you want and then come back to your hideaway down here. This property is actually a deeded easement. You're a mile from anywhere No airplanes, trains, automobiles. If you're a homesteader, deer hunter, turkey hunter, or nature lover, it doesn't matter. This place has it all. The first day of deer season this year, there was a gentleman on his deer stand and he counted 57 deer. We know they're here. We have more deer on this property than literally any property I've ever listed. So it's just absolutely gorgeous. It's probably the premier property for deer hunting that I've ever been on. So this property is 70 acres. The way it's set up, the ridges and different opportunities to hunt in different locations. This place will probably hunt like about a 150-acre place. There's places to put food plots, or you can put them high, you can put them down here in this bottom. So there's a lot of this property that has potential for some excellent food plots. Not that there's not enough food here right now to feed them. We have Toronto Springs just across the way here that has row crop ground. It's got this beautiful hillside. This 70 acres also has never been logged. So the timber stand improvements you can make here could put a little money in your pocket and help you pay for your food plots, your deer hunting, and just make this property overall better and get paid doing it. If you're into the homesteading lifestyle, this would probably be one of the best properties you could come to. You could come in here and stay and never have to leave and never talk to another human being for as long as you wanted. Maybe you might run into a neighbor every now and then, but this place is without a doubt remote. It's got the wet glaze and the dry glaze running through it. We've got crappie, suckers, smallmouth bass. We got largemouth bass. We got the Lake of the Ozarks. Glaze arm here. This actually goes to the Lake of the Ozarks at Twin Bridges, so it dumps right in. You could go right around the corner and be at State Park #1. At certain times of year, I know for a fact you're going to be able to do a kayak from here and make it all the way to the Lake of the Ozarks. Beautiful float trip.
Hey folks, I've been hunting with this man for a long time, and he's got some choice properties to hunt. In fact, you have some land right now where we got this Big Tom this morning. Beautiful properties.
Yeah.
Beautiful properties. I tell you folks, if you want to invest in some great hunt land here in the Ozarks, mushrooms, right close to the big old bass in the Lake of the Ozarks.
Big bucks.
Big bucks.
Big bucks.
Son, you need to get involved with this man. He can help you out. Thanks again.
You bet, Roland. Thank you.
So this area is so special because of all the springs and rivers and caves, and without a doubt the most remote property that I've ever listed, and I would love to bring you out and show you this property. My name's Mark James with United Country Results Real Estate and Auction. UC Hunting Properties powered by Realtree. Probably one of the most premier deer hunting properties I've ever listed. If you would like to come and see it, just give me a call at 573-405-0112.